Hello there, and welcome to Beyond the Surface, where the saying to be seen is to be understood comes to life. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. I live and work on Gundungurra land, and I acknowledge the traditional landowners of my guests near and far. I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and cultures of our First Nations people. The land below my feet is, was, and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm no stranger to the profound journey of pain, grief, anger, and heartbreak that often accompanies the loss of church, community, faith, and the unwinding of our core beliefs. In the midst of this, though, I found healing in the stories shared by others who walked a similar path to me. Here, in the warmth of these digital walls, I want you to feel at home. This is a space where your memories and your story is not just acknowledged, but deeply seen and believed. So kick back, relax, and let's embark on a journey where your story is not just heard, but embraced. I want to welcome you to a community where storytelling is a powerful force. This is Beyond the Surface. Welcome, Amanda. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
I am excited about this episode because something that I really wanted out of this podcast was to normalize the diversity of experiences within like religious trauma and deconstruction. And I really wanted to normalize for people that deconstruction did not have to mean deconversion. And that's
Hmm.
what I think of when I think of you, is
Yeah,
your content.
that's where I
Yes,
fit.
you fall into that category. And I love that because I think, there is a lot of content out about deconstruction that's really wonderful. But um I just really wanted, I guess, to normalize a really diverse range of responses to different things. I'm sure we will get more into that, but let's first start with you. Where does your story start?
Oh man, I don't know, 7 generations ago. I
Yep.
I grew up in a very Christian rooted family that well, I don't think it's seven, I think it's six that my siblings and I were the sixth generation to go to the church that I grew up in. So a
Wow.
long history of Christianity in the same region of the United States.
Oh my goodness. And
Yeah.
is that Michigan where you are now, or yeah?
Yes, yep,
Yeah.
in kind of central rural Michigan.
Okay.
Um, and I would say faith made sense to me as a kid. My right, like my family was pretty active in our church. It made sense. I really love a structure of how to live your life, and this was
Mhm.
great.
The
And along
rules?
the way, yeah, I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
tell me what to do. What's the right thing to do? Great, I will do it. I was
Yeah.
on board.
Okay.
Um, right. And there were these sprinklings now that I look back of questions of how things are done, questions between even different churches in the same town. I had friends that would go to different churches and would say different things that we didn't do or didn't think or believe. So I knew that there were some differences.
Mm,
But I think it was okay to hold that when you're still within the structure of your family of like, oh, everybody that I'm immediately around is kind of doing the same thing.
yeah. Yeah. And so it sounds almost like the Christian childhood that we talk about was actually a really safe place for you.
Yeah, it was. I reflecting back, I could take some questions to my dad and he would pull out his Bible and it always kind of resulted in like, well, this is why we believe what we believe, or this is why this is right, which again kind of made sense to me somewhat. I think I could hold a little bit more nuance and looking back, I think I could recognize I was holding some nuance versus maybe what my dad was like, this
Mm,
is the right way to believe, or this is why we believe this.
yeah.
But yeah, generally overall, um, felt okay within church belief system.
Mm. When did
Yeah.
when did that, because often for I guess people who grow up in a Christian home, when did that become personal for you and not just what your family believed?
Yeah, I would say maybe like junior or senior year of high school. I think I just had more experiences. It's when I taught my first Sunday school class. Got into the academic portion of like
Yeah.
faith. And so I think that, yeah, but I don't know. It was pretty personal pretty early on, right? Like I was buying my own books from the Christian bookstore. I was listed like burning like Christian CDs that my friends had. Um,
I'm
remember that?
like,
Remember burning CDs?
yeah,
Maybe
I
that's aging
know.
me.
No, I do. I do remember that. But all I'm thinking is, my first thought was burning CDs doesn't seem like the most good Christian girl thing to
Yeah,
do.
no, there's a disconnect. I was like, this doesn't, I don't see the problem.
Um,
Maybe that
what?
was, maybe that was the moment. Maybe that
Yeah,
planted
I
the seed.
know. Maybe that's the earliest memory of that inner
Like,
rebellious. Uh,
capitalism, I'm not paying these prices.
I know. Oh my goodness. I can't, I just have gone back to like my teenage years for a second. Okay, so the burning CDs has like,
Yeah, you know, Rebecca St.
yeah,
James, and we're like,
I'm back
hey.
when I was like 15, right at this
Yeah.
moment. Do you remember what you loved about it as a child?
I loved the fairness. I think my mom would say from a really early age that was something that I really valued, things being fair.
Yeah.
Um, and so I felt like Jesus's message had some fairness to it. Everybody was treated kind of equally. Um, yeah, I think it made right like there wasn't necessarily like I'm thinking of how my parents raised me, and there wasn't really any contradiction. Like, oh, this makes sense because this is what we're already doing.
Mm,
Um, so again, that made sense with maybe my nature or my nurture.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and I think just the connectedness that it connected me to my family as well.
Mm. And so, I mean, often when we think of Christian homes, we think authoritarian almost, particularly, I might be saying this particularly because I'm an outsider looking in on the American religious landscape, which
Uh-huh.
is crazy town, to be quite fair. But often we think, quite strict, quite authoritarian, very disciplined. But it sounds almost like that wasn't your experience.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I feel like my first inkling of deconstruction or something wasn't quite making sense was this I could almost see this unfairness between like my mom's role and my dad's role. And again, I'm all about fair. Like my dad could come home and my mom was just kind of working the whole day,
Yeah.
even though she had a job too. But I don't remember anything about, like, I don't remember anything from the pulpit about complementarianism. I think it must have just been like the zeitgeist where
Mm,
I don't know. I don't know, where I somehow knew that there were roles that people expected, but I did not like that. And I was like, I could not be in a marriage like this. And so I think I was an
yeah.
egalitarian from a very young age.
Yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, there were other things. So, like, that is kind of and I asked my parents about this a couple of years ago of like, how did you guys decide this? And it wasn't where I thought maybe it was this conscious thing or this assumed roles. For them, it just seemed like, oh, this is kind of what they fell into, or maybe like the assumptions of the time period they grew up in. But my dad also, like, we played Dungeons and Dragons growing up. We read Harry Potter, right? So there was also this,
Right.
I think, freedom or sense of us being able to tell what was reality and what wasn't, or what was
Yeah.
spiritual warfare and what wasn't.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
Yeah.
because that I would think would be relatively rare. I mean, even the my former church would not have endorsed Harry Potter, that's for
And
sure.
I don't think my church did. I remembered
Yeah.
a member of the church I grew up in one time, like bringing in a Pokemon card and being like, see, they're talking about evolution. And even in my little kid mind, I was like, I don't think that means what you think. Like that is a cartoon.
That seems like a big gap between like trying to
Right.
connect two things that are really not connected right now. And I want to preface what the term that I'm about to use is very different in Australia, but it almost sounds like you like quite liberal Christians almost.
It may be compared, but my parents
Yeah.
like still grew up in a pretty staunchly
Okay.
Republican or like, yeah,
Right.
politically conservative
Okay.
home. Um, but yeah, and my church wasn't a part of a denomination, so I wonder if we missed out a little bit from like this bigger cultural conversation.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, we I guess maybe had a little bit more liberalism in
mm,
some areas, but then not in others.
okay. Yeah. Um, and so what were your teenage years like? Were you the all-in Christian who was, evangelizing, teaching Sunday school, doing all of the ministries?
Um, no, we didn't actually have a lot of opportunities like that. And I was a pretty shy kid, so the idea of evangelizing was uh not to for me. Did not did not jive with my personality. And I didn't feel um too much conviction about that either.
Yeah.
Right. I had my group of Christian friends in high school and we were pretty straight-laced and that that was it.
Hey. It's so interesting because often you do find those things like the savior complex and needing to sort of save everybody and that real always have an answer for your faith sort of mentality that gets instilled. Um, but it's almost like you're in a little bubble.
Yeah, or
Yeah.
it's like I think I was more concerned about my personal faith than maybe the faith of
Yeah.
others.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's probably not the wrong answer, I would think.
right.
I think if people were probably more concerned about their own faith than the faith of others, then maybe we might not be having this conversation. But
Yeah, lived a
um,
quiet, shy, introspective
yes,
existence in high school.
absolutely. And so how did your faith interact with your relationships sort of in high school and leading out of that environment?
Um, yeah, it interacted pretty smoothly. I would say the people that I was closest to kind of held the same worldview, way of seeing things. I ended up going to a Christian university after high school. Um, one, because I was like, oh, this is smaller. This fits my vibe. But I think also because my faith was important to me. And I think being in an environment where other like I did like having that bubble and I was like, where can I go to have more of that?
Yeah, yeah,
Where yeah, it feels safe and maybe right, like maybe in that sense there was this internal, I think, a little bit of fear of like being in the world and how am I going to operate and is that going to create this conflict for me? And so I think there was part of me that's like, oh, this just makes sense to go to a Christian university.
yeah. And so when did things start shifting for you?
Yeah, it was right. I think being around people that grew up in other traditions and introducing other ideas, especially like women in ministry. So even though I was egalitarian on the home front, like the splitting of duties within the home, I think there's still this mindset of like, well, not in the church. And
Yeah,
so coming in contact with people that have other beliefs, just started introducing that information. We had my college had what was called a lifestyle statement, which was basically like a kind of a code of conduct and had right like pretty heteronormative um, traditional Christian teachings around that. And so the year after I graduated, there was a queer straight alliance group that came to kind of challenge that.
Right.
And I remember wanting to show up and wanting to hear and listen and like coming back as an alumni. And that was pretty impactful because I think that was probably the first time that I was aware
Yeah.
that I was interacting with queer Christians. And so I think just having these experiences start to plant those seeds of like, wait a minute. But it
Mm,
wasn't really until I in my mid 20s had decided I was going to apply for some long-term missions opportunities and I needed a sending church. And I had been going to a mega church here in the city that I live in now where nobody really knew me. And so it didn't make sense to be like, hey, can you be my sending church? And so I ended up going back to the church that I grew up in. But throughout that process, it became evident that there were some theological differences
right.
between the missions organization and the church that I grew up in to the point where the church I grew up in basically couldn't send me. They didn't feel comfortable sending me with this. And
Yeah.
I was like, hold the phone. Like
Ah,
we're all Christians. What is going on? Which sent me into this 2 month spiral of like, well, there has to be one right way, like, well, to give me my structure, and I'm gonna
yeah.
follow that. And so I went into this theological spiral of, well, what's the one right way to believe? And that's what I'm gonna believe. And then that just exploded my mind of like, oh, there's basically like four different ways to believe about everything. And so
Yeah.
for someone who couldn't really handle the gray at the time, it was just this explosion of my faith.
Yeah. I mean, what a way to pop the
Or
bubble,
implosion,
right?
I should say, of like, what?
Yeah.
Calvinism? Arminianism? There's different ways to think about baptism? When are we saved? What does this even mean? Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I mean, even just like starting at the beginning with like all of the different ideas and teachings and doctrines around creation, like before you even get any further than like that
Yeah.
single first story, would, yeah, what a way to pop that bubble that you were
Yes. And I think it was the
in.
first time that I had, right? Like I knew there were different ways to think about things, but I didn't realize that it was all encompassing, that there are certain, right? Like that could have a completely different take on this. And so it just kind of destroyed my identity.
Yeah. And I somewhat get that in terms that like I also at times I guess in the way that I do life I like structure and I like there to be like boundaries and I joke there's a bit of a running joke where people say just go with the flow and I'm like I'll go with the flow, but what time does the flow start and finish?
Right.
And what are we doing
Yes.
while we're flowing? Like,
Yes.
so, um, what did that feel like to have that
Oh,
very safe bubble explode in an instant?
yeah. Well, it felt like anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
It felt like everything that I thought was true may not be
Mm,
true. So there, right? Like I'm sure that feeling, I was going to say betrayal, but it wasn't necessarily centered around a person. Like I didn't feel like someone misled me. I felt like the whole
mm,
system was lying to me.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so there was like a period of time where I was crying almost every day because of the anxiety of like, well, if this isn't true, then what does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Um,
And was the anxiety around what does that mean for the future? What does that mean for the life that I've already lived? Or both?
it wasn't so much about the life I had already lived. I didn't necessarily feel regret. It was more the sense of like, well, how do I move forward if I don't have this worldview that is intact anymore? It was almost like, how do I even be human if I
Yeah.
don't know what to believe, what I'm basing this off of?
Mm,
Um, and so I wallowed in that for about 2 months until the point where I'm like, I can't be crying every day. Like, I'm just like, I don't know what's true, but I'm going to, like, if anything's true, it's that God has grace and I'm just going to live in that. And so I kind of turned that part of my brain and emotions off for a couple months, until it spilled over again. And then I was like, oh, I got to do something about this.
I'm thinking 2 months. That's pretty good. I feel like that's a pretty good amount of time. Like that's quite
Well,
impressive,
2 months of
to be
crying,
fair.
maybe 3 months of turning it off. And then I was like, this is a perfect time to probably start dating someone and that'll go great. And
Okay.
it didn't. And then
Right.
when that ended, it was just like, oh man, here's an explosion of everything.
Yeah.
What is life?
What was your relationship with God like during that 2 months? How did it impact that?
I think it was the first time in my, I kind of just went really hard into that idea of like, okay, God is like, I've been actively keeping my faith alive up until this part, and now I'm going to give that to God if God even exists, because I cannot actively do this anymore. Like he's gonna have to
Yeah.
like hold that for me,
Mm,
and I am just gonna go and be and do some like go experience some things for a
yeah.
minute.
Yeah. Goodness. And even, I feel like even that takes an element of like, there's fear in that because it's like, I'm giving something that has been
Yeah,
so like precious, so intimate up until now into at the point probably feeling like into the unknown, like that song out of
yeah.
Frozen.
It was basically like I didn't have any more energy to care, and if God was real,
Yeah.
then he had to care for a little bit, and I was just gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna trust you saying who you say you are, and I'm gonna
Yeah.
go have a drink.
I love that. Okay, so in this point, you are still just you. There is no partner, there is no spouse. It is
Right.
just
Yes.
you. Okay. So how did all of that impact you? You just sort of said, I'm gonna go and start dating. What was that
Yeah.
like?
Well, the other thing I would say this is where so I grew up in purity culture, and I would say purity culture got me pretty good.
Yeah.
So I was under the impression like I'm gonna date one person and that's gonna be it. I'm gonna do it right, bada bing, moving
Yeah.
forward. Okay, I found the person. This is it. And then that lasted for like 2 months, and then it ended. And then I was like, purity culture isn't real either.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
what do I do? So um yeah, right. Like I think there were these stories happening in the background that I wasn't even aware were impacting me. And then coupled with this faith that was deteriorating after that relationship ended, um, yeah, it was pretty much depression. Like it was my first episode of like major depression.
Right. Okay.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I would imagine that you would not have used the language of purity culture back then.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Um,
So what were some of the thoughts that were going through your head at that time? Because obviously now we know that it's purity culture and that's what that's sort of cemented in. But what was it for
yeah,
you at the time?
I think there was just a lot of self-blame. I don't think I had enough periphery or nuance to realize why this relationship wouldn't have continued further than it did.
Yeah.
But at the time, it felt like um, like it was something that I had done. There's some deficiency, some shame, some way that I was not
Yeah.
good enough, or that I had acted in ways that resulted in this. So it was a real huge personalization. Like there's no other factor for this ending other than
I
something was
felt.
wrong.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, yeah.
What was
Which
it
I feel a lot of compassion right now for that younger version of
Yeah,
myself. Like, oh,
absolutely.
sweetie.
Gosh, I mean it is, I mean that's just one of one of the vast many things that is wrong with purity culture. But
Yeah.
that's just
Yes.
like the tip of the iceberg. But um I mean just that burden of responsibility almost that of course it had to be you.
Yes. Because
Like
isn't this
it's
the way that it's supposed to turn out? Aren't you supposed to
yeah.
have find this one person and that be it.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so then I think that was the point where I'm like, is God even real? Does
Yeah.
any of this even matter? And that, yeah, put me into a pretty existential crisis.
Yeah. What was that crisis like, sort of going through it and coming out the other side of it?
Yeah, it was pretty dark. I remember being pretty flat, having to go to work,
Mm,
friends noticing, and then kind of got to a point where I was like, I don't think I can stop being a Christian because that's been my entire life, like the foundation that I've grown up and seen the world is. So if I'm going to stay in this, I need to figure out how to make this work.
yeah.
Um, and that's, yeah, I'm trying to think of, because I think I was like searching for another church at the time too. Like there was,
Yeah.
I was doing too much.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so um, I think that's when I started therapy for the first time, really, and found out that, oh, you've got a lot of anxious tendencies. Oh, there's some anxiety in here that makes you love structure.
Therapy does wonders for finding all of
Yes,
these things.
yes.
Um, it always, I don't know whether it's just I mean, organized religion is not always the number one fan of therapy, right? We know that fairly well. But for some reason, it's always the moment that somebody goes to therapy that things start to unravel to the point that like I can actually do something with this. It's not just a bunch of unknowns and question marks. Um,
Yeah. Or that introduction of nuance and gray
yeah,
of like, oh, wait, things can be
yeah,
gray and that can be okay. How can that be okay? Teach me.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, nuance. Therapy is really good at breaking that binary thinking, because
Yeah.
it is often, well, what if it's not? You know,
Yes.
that's how
And
it's always
your
been.
brain
Why?
has never brought up into your consciousness, right?
Yeah,
Like anxiety is going to keep you
absolutely.
in that narrow of like, this is the only way to do it, and you're not doing it. And you
Mm,
have no idea that there's all these other possibilities or questions or way it can be out here until, yeah, I don't know. My first therapist was like, you can't be your own therapist. And I was like, that's so true because you
mm.
only have the mind that you have, and you might be missing something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will not go into my therapist brain for a second because otherwise our conversation will go into a whole different direction.
Yeah, well,
Um,
let's each put on our therapist cap and
I know. What was that process like? Because I would imagine that, for somebody who has had a lot of structure and has known what is what for so long, to suddenly not know what is what would be
yeah,
overwhelming.
yeah, it was like relearning how to be in the world and what I actually thought.
Mm,
And a couple months after starting therapy, I decided that I needed to make sense of what I thought about faith, and I the best way to do that would be in a structured environment. So I ended up taking um, three systematic theology classes at a seminary here in where I live. That basically went through. So at the same time, I'm getting this nuance and this learning how to live in the gray in therapy. I had a professor that was really good about teaching us the different ideas around theological concepts and giving us the parameters of like, here's here's within um yeah, here's what faithful Christians have believed at different points. And so I think both of those combined really helped me, again, for the first time, mark out what I believed. We had to write these things called confessions. So we had to go through different
mm,
systems of theology. So creation, man, um, Jesus, the church, um, and say what we actually believed. And so it was this really helpful exercise. And I think the first time that I was honest of like, I don't know if I can find scriptural representation of this, but this is actually what I believe.
Yeah.
So there was this freedom in kind of coming back to myself as well of being like, oh, I can have a say in what I believe.
Yeah. Yeah. And stepping outside of, what do I believe rather than what was I taught?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did that go down with your family?
Um, I don't know. My siblings know more about my story than my parents do. Um, I, I yeah, my parents and I don't really talk about that. And even this work that I do now, I'm not sure they have a clear understanding either because they haven't investigated or haven't asked.
Mm,
Um, I think there's a little bit of a like don't ask, don't tell in our family. Like, oh, is everyone going to church? Good, everyone's in good shape. So,
right.
yes, but it was helpful talking to my siblings.
Yeah.
And I've always been, I don't know if it's the therapist part in me, the second born part in me. I've always been the one to kind of be more vulnerable and rock the boat. And so I was fine talking to my siblings, and they've each had their own kind of experience within deconstruction, reconstruction.
Yeah.
And so they know my story a little bit.
Yeah. Um, what was it like starting to, I mean, what you described was very much, I guess, creating your own core belief statement almost
Yeah.
about Christianity. And so what was it like sort of sitting with some of those things that you believed versus what you had been taught? Because I know that you do some of my favorite content of yours is challenging the role of women in the church and
Yeah.
that sort of content, or women in the home, and I guess a biblical view of women, if we say. And so what was it like starting to wrestle between what you believed versus what you were taught?
Yeah, I think it was a challenge because I think at the time I was like, I got to make sure that this is biblically sound. And I had been starting to go to a church that had a husband and wife co-pastors. And so that was one of the things that my professor did push back on because I was talking about like I believe elders can be adults. Um, and he was like, well, that's not actually what that verse in Timothy says. And I was like, I think that was the first time where I was like, well, I think this could probably be interpreted differently. So even
Yeah.
I don't know. I think it was that what once I got taught that there was gray, it kind of gave me this boldness to be like, well, I think there can be nuance or different ways to think about this. And I don't even have to take my professor's interpretation of this.
Yeah.
So I
And
think there was this spicy part that came forward and was like, this is what I believe.
yeah, exactly. And I feel like when somebody gets introduced to the gray, it's like we love the gray. The gray is great. Black and white is hard once you realize that there's so much gray. But I think I love I mean, for anybody who knows Harry Potter, I'm a born Slytherin. So I love the feisty parts of people who go, well, you know what, you can believe that and that's okay. And
Yeah.
that's not what I believe.
Yes. And
Uh,
then connecting to other people of like, oh, there is a really robust, people
yeah,
have already done the robust work of like egalitarianism.
yeah,
Um, or I remember as my theology started to change around um queerness, right? Like
mm,
queer Christians and how that fits into the church and theology. And I remember right? Like those early moments of the tension of like, is this okay to think? Is this okay to to be there? Um, yeah. So this growing and changing. think it starts with experiences. You get introduced to an idea that you hadn't thought of before, or the
Yeah.
possibility, or maybe this already innate knowing of, oh, I'm just allowing this knowing to be more revealed.
Yeah. Was there a moment for you where things started to feel more settled in terms of what you believed? Or is it still a little like controlled chaos?
Yeah, I feel like I'm trying to think. I'm like, was it settled before the 2016 election?
Oh gosh.
Maybe.
Was
But then it wasn't.
yeah,
I've always said after I had that my big deconstruction, I think doubt is always going to be a part of my faith. Like I don't think I'm ever going to go back to this simplicity of believing. I just that's not my brain is not wired like that anymore.
yeah.
Nor is I don't think faith is simple.
No.
Um, so I think I've just been able to tolerate the doubt
Yeah.
more.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, even now, right? Like I think there are still things that I'm growing and being challenged on and thinking about. And I keep going. I talk to my clients all the time about having anchor points. So, right, like God's faithfulness with this anchor point um during my big deconstruction. And that continues to be an anchor point for me when I feel like, have I gone too far? And it's like,
Yeah.
well, no, I think God is for me. He
Mm,
has faithfulness. I'm not going to get everything right 100%. That's a freeing statement.
yeah. Yeah. Now, I am going to jump on the 2016 election comment
Oh
and go
yeah.
and
Gonna happen again.
go
We're gonna
and oh my gosh, even us in here,
gearing up
I
for
was terrified in 2016. I was like, oh my gosh, this is a disaster for the universe. Um, but I'm gonna use that as like inspiration because often I will ask this question of people who still have some level of Christian faith, which
Mhm.
is how do you personally reconcile the good God that you believe in with the harm that happens under the banner of Christianity?
Yeah. I don't know if you can reconcile it,
Yeah.
right? Like I think and it's funny because a lot of the faith that I was given that I still think is core to me was given by people who acted in ways that really surprised me during election cycles. Right.
Okay.
So here are the people that have given me my faith that have shaped it toward
Mm,
care for the poor and care for creation and yet are acting in sometimes opposite ways of I feel like what they told me. It feels really parallel to like mental health as well, right? So like there, I think when people are operating in this way that seems really toxic, I
yeah.
also think that there is it is coming from this part that has not, it's coming from a place of fear or control or power. This part is trying to do something that hasn't necessarily been like looked at or loved or cared for.
That is a very
And
compassionate
granted,
way of
I,
looking at it.
I know I do I do tend toward
Oh,
compassion for
yeah.
people. I also am open to right, like there may be things that other people are getting right and I am getting wrong.
Yeah.
Um, but I also think like ego can be pretty strong. Ego can take us a lot of places that you think are being led by the Holy Spirit.
Mm,
And even I'm saying that I'm like, oh, I need to check myself before I wreck myself. But like, yeah, I think I think ego can be pretty strong and can take people. People can grab the banner of God and let ego take it places that it probably shouldn't be.
yeah, absolutely. And I am going to make an assumption here because I have a feeling I have seen it on your Instagram. Do you still use the label of Christian?
Yeah, I do because I think um, you know, it still has a little bit of like a universal understanding of what that means.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about making
Yeah.
a, I'm thinking of that Mean Girls quote, like I'm a Christian, but I'm a cool Christian.
Oh gosh.
Um, I'm not like other Christians. I'm a cool Christian.
Oh gosh, that's great. I love Mean Girls. That was a great movie. Oh,
So yeah, I do. And I hope that if people interact with my content or interact with me, they are seeing that that is a nuanced,
yeah.
passionate version of
Mm,
Christianity.
yeah. And I mean, the reason that I asked is because I guess even people that I personally know who have deconstructed, who might still hold, I guess, what I would deem a Christian faith, don't necessarily use the word because it is quite a
Yeah.
loaded term, I guess, and
Yeah.
um, it comes with a lot. It's like it's got a lot of baggage with that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, it does. And so that might have to be teased out. And I could imagine, right, like me saying that there may be those listening right now that are like, ooh, well, what does that mean? What type of Christian? What do you think about
Yeah.
this?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And um I guess that's the fun part of deconstruction, right? Is
yeah. You kind of get to determine what you're, yeah, what that does that make sense? Does that resonate?
yeah, rather than just blindly listening to somebody else.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think deconstruction is this, I don't know, given back to, and again, right, like I don't want it to be the ego taking over, but I think it's this kind of self-determination getting turned up a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it has absolutely given a sense of autonomy and a sense of almost self-empowerment as opposed to oppression, which is
Mhm.
often or submission is
Yeah.
often the word that would come up. Um, what I'm gonna throw, and this is a big question, so I guess you can
Yeah.
answer it
Perfect.
however you like. What do you believe?
Oh man. Okay. Well,
Yeah, it is a big question. I prefaced.
right. And I feel
I'm
like
curious where your sense of spirituality and belief lands
like
now. Yeah.
spirituality is this orb that is flowing in and out, right? Like so I still hold to some of the core Christian tenets, right? Like if there's a God of the universe,
Yeah.
um, that Jesus is somehow divine and human and points toward that God of the universe, that there's ultimately moving us closer to like love and connection and repair. Um, I believe even miracles, even though I probably have seen some miracles, but yeah, I believe that miracles are possible, that there is, that we have power to change things, whether that is through what is it like the quantum realm or vibrations or
Yeah.
prayer? I'm not sure, right? Like there's this mystery. I believe in mystery. There's
Mm,
mystery to this. I
yeah.
believe that um, God is for the inclusion of all people, that I don't think um, sexuality bars us from a relationship to God.
Yeah.
I believe that there have been a lot of missed opportunities to love people and include people. Um, I guess, yeah,
I love
that's what I
that.
got for you today. That's where I'm
Yeah,
at
no,
today.
I love that. And I really love the mystery. I love that part because often, the faith that I was raised in was not about mystery, it was about certainty, right?
Yeah.
And
The
so
older I
even
get and the more
yeah,
I've been alive, I it just feels like God is doing something, and I probably know 0.5% of what he's doing.
yeah, absolutely. And I guess, that mystery is probably just another term of nuance, right? Is just like I'm holding lots of different things. I don't really know how I'm holding them or what I'm holding, but I'm holding them.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Like
Yeah.
it feels like this again, this like orb of belief that can't quite be
Yeah.
contained.
Yeah. And I love that because I think that's malleable. It's not, it's not a block of wood that is like sturdy and firm. It's malleable. It moves.
Yeah.
And I love that because we as humans move through the world and we have relationships and we have emotions and, all of those things. And I think whatever somebody's sense of spirituality is should move with their humanity almost.
Yeah. Um, Meredith Ann Miller, who wrote a book called Woven, talks about the analogy of like a spider web, that if a point of a spider web is cut off, there's enough other anchor points that you can
Mm.
like rebuild or figure that out, right? So versus this block of wood or this stool of like a leg gets blown out or all the legs get blown out, it can't withstand. Where having some flexible structure to your spirituality is probably going to be of a benefit,
That's a
so that
great
you don't go into your
analogy.
existential depression spiral.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I love that, especially considering my therapy practice is anchored counseling. So I love that. I love
Oh,
that analogy. That's
that's a
great.
freebie.
Yeah. Um, what brings you joy and peace now?
Oh, in my faith or in life?
Both.
I have a lot of joy. I started doing kitten foster care during the pandemic, and it has just brought
Oh,
me a lot of joy to take care of
oh,
baby cats.
oh, that is
There's
adorable.
gotta be a God in this world if there are baby cats in this world.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm allergic to cats, but they are
Oh,
very cute,
they
particularly
are
as
very cute.
kittens. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, that is
I think
adorable.
also, I don't know, conversations like this, like spiritual conversations, right? Like probably most people that are listening to this podcast, or a majority of people, are feeling like there is something greater than ourselves.
Mm.
And I don't know, just having conversations about that can be life-giving. I feel energized right now having this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mean I've said to most people that the reason that I started this podcast was I wanted that saying to be seen is to be understood. That's what I wanted out of this podcast was, even if it's just one episode, one moment in an episode where you've somebody random in the world feels seen and reassured and validated in their
Yeah.
experience because it so often is quite lonely and insular and isolating. And I mean, even in the therapy world, the term religious trauma is relatively new. Um,
Hmm.
and and so there is all of this new language for people to be able to explain what they're going through.
Yeah.
But one of the best things for me was to hear it from the people who were going through it, right? Because
Hmm.
they know,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
and it is quite a unique space. And so I just wanted to create a space where people were validated in what they were going through somebody else's story, not through a whole bunch of
Mm.
education, but just through
Yeah.
somebody's story.
Yes.
Um, so, on that, my last question for all of these episodes is what do you say to that person who is fresh in their deconstruction and they have no idea what to do?
Yeah. Right, like your journey is going to be your journey, but what I wish I had known, I think it could have saved me, is to connect to a helper, connect to resources, connect to others, because it can be this isolating journey. And if you only have what's going on in your head, you're probably missing something that is vital for your moving through this experience. So whether it's a coach or a therapist or right, it can be hard in this space because you don't know who else is going through this or asking these questions or who to trust.
Yeah.
Um, And similarly to what you said before, that's kind of why I started this coaching aspect of what I do, because I didn't have any resources or I didn't know anyone else going through this at the time. And
Yeah.
I was like, if I can prevent someone from feeling like that or feel connected or see that they're not alone in this,
Yeah.
um, that is what motivates me in that.
Absolutely. I mean, it was my therapist who first used the term deconstruction, and I had no idea what that meant at the time. And so, um, yeah, I love you find your people and find a resource and
Yes.
support. And if you don't know where to start, I'm sure that if you reach out to one of us on Instagram, we will help you find somebody in your
Yes.
I know in the US it is um you guys have very strict rules around like therapy and things like that, and only practicing in the state and things like that. I have a little bit more freedom in the fact that I can
Ooh.
counsel worldwide except the US and Canada. So
Oh, that's so interesting.
yeah, yeah. So I know
We can
like
only
there are loopholes, but like I mean,
Well, that's where my coaching, so I have a
yeah,
therapy practice for my Michigan clients, and then I have coaching, which is
coaching is
less,
the
I'm not
loophole.
diagnosing, I'm not doing specific
Yeah,
modalities of treatment, but I
yeah,
am leading groups
yeah,
and doing some one-on-one short term.
yeah,
So
yeah.
that allows me
Coaching
to
is the
reach,
loophole.
yeah, a
Um,
little bit. Yes, the safe,
yes.
legal, ethical loophole.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, not dodgy in any mean. It's just
Yeah,
a loophole.
yes,
Yeah, I mean, there is a really wonderful space of people and community of people who are now talking about this online. And so find someone who is talking about it, and I'm sure that they will point you in the direction of somebody who knows what they're talking about in this space. And the last thing that you need is to land into a therapist or a coach's office who doesn't understand this landscape and
yeah.
potentially can make you feel worse, right?
Yes.
So,
And I fit matters. And I always say that, yes, I'm the coach for people that are hoping to stay within their Christian faith.
yeah.
But I know other coaches that are at different places on the spectrum of deconstruction. And if that is the coach for you, like I am happy to give you
Yeah,
information.
yeah,
Not
absolutely.
going to be for everybody, but I am going to be for,
Yeah.
yeah, there are going to be people that want this service and space too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, like I said at the beginning of the episode, it's so diverse, and
Yes.
there is a diverse range of people who are out there to help as well. So
Mhm.
it's finding what is going to work for you in that moment, and that might change, but in that
Yep.
moment, you find what works in that moment. So,
Yes.
um, thank you for joining me.
This is great.
I
Feel
know
energized and
it's
it's
so fun, right? I've loved it. I feel like I've been not non-stop recording for like the last month, and I've got more to go. But it's yeah, I agree. It's energizing. It's nice to talk to people who um understand that on a different level. So
yeah,
it's wonderful.
yeah.
So
Awesome.
thank you. Thanks for listening to Beyond the Surface. Until next time, take care, stay true to who you are, and remember, your voice and your story matters, always.